trees can eventually make their way into space. So first, let's get started by why don't you think about why space stations might need trees? And I just want you to go ahead and tap your answer into the chat box, and I'll give you 30 seconds to a minute to do so. But yeah, just let me know why you think space stations might need trees. Okay. All right, so any ideas? Let's see. Oh yeah, so we got one person saying that they might need trees to provide oxygen. That's a very good idea. So let's see. So I'm not seeing anyone else, so we can keep going. Yes, so one of the biggest things that trees could do in a space station is provide oxygen for all the people who are living there. So nice job, Kayla. So right here we have a simple diagram of the carbon cycle, and it's a little complicated, but no need to go into it in too much detail. I just want you to notice how there's a lot of different parts of Earth that are involved in this carbon cycle, including like the oceans. We've got this, and they release oxygen, and that's like their biggest role in the carbon cycle. And so now I want you guys to think about what parts of the carbon cycle might be missing from a space station. So again, just go ahead and think about this for a couple of seconds and then type your answer into the chat box and let me know what you guys are thinking. Okay, I'm having difficulties pulling up my chat box, but I don't think anyone quite the same as it would be on Earth. However, trees can help create this carbon cycle on an international space station, parts of Europe and Canada, and it's primarily a big research laboratory. And so they conduct a lot of experiments in things like astronomy, meteorology, astrobiology, and physics, along with many others. And a particular field we're interested in is astrobiology, which is just the idea people who were living there for a long time arrived in the year 2000. And ever since then, it has had people living in the space station. So that's for over 20 years now. And then, like I said before, the atmosphere has been created to be similar to Earth. So they create similar concentrations of the different gases that are in the atmosphere, and then the similar pressure as well. And then what they have on this space station are water recycling devices, so they can reuse water that's been brought up there. And then they also have this fancy process called electrolysis, and that's what they do with that is create oxygen for the spacemen to breathe out of the water that they bring up there. And so this graph is a little complicated, but don't get too overwhelmed. This is basically just a diagram to explain all the different processes that go on in a space station to make it breathable and a happy environment for people who are living there. And what I want you to pay attention to is how in this system there's waste. Things are happening, they throw it away. And what this creates is a problem where we are always needing supplies coming from Earth into the space station to make up for this waste. And so what this would be called is it's not a closed loop system. A loop being something where it's a system that would be closed looped, so there wouldn't be as much waste, particularly with the carbon dioxide and the hydrogen. They have this hypothetical framework for how they could use those things so that they don't waste any of it. And so this would be considered a closed loop system. And that's kind of the ideal situation for the International Space Station, where there isn't any waste, because it's very expensive and costly to transport supplies from Earth into the space station. But notice here, this is a created carbon cycle, if you will, and there are no plants involved in this system, but that doesn't have to be the case all of the time. And so part of this system, and the part that we're really concerned with, is this removal of carbon dioxide. And if you recall from the carbon cycle, mammals such as humans release carbon dioxide when they breathe. And so in the International Space Station, they need a process to get rid of all that carbon dioxide that we don't want. And so what they do is they use this cool material called zeolite, and this is a picture of it right there. And basically, it's this mineral that has these pores or holes in it. And these holes, you can use them to capture carbon dioxide from the air that's been exhaled by the astronauts. They've got these tiny pores that lock in those carbon dioxide molecules. And this process of taking carbon dioxide from the air is called carbon dioxide scrubbing, because it's kind of like the mineral is scrubbing the air of these molecules of carbon dioxide. And then what the astronauts do is they take the minerals of the zeolite that is full of the carbon dioxide, and then they expose it to space. And the harsh conditions of space cause the carbon dioxide to be removed from the mineral, and then that allows the astronauts to reuse the zeolite so it can take in even more carbon dioxide, so they can have this cycle of having the mineral take in the carbon dioxide. And then they take the mineral outside of the space station to get rid of the carbon dioxide, and then they can bring the mineral back in to be reused. And trees can actually serve a similar role to this, because if you recall from that first diagram of the carbon cycle, trees take in carbon dioxide, so they act like a scrubber from the air, so they can pull in the carbon dioxide and hold on to it, so that way it gets out of the atmosphere within the International Space Station. And so in addition to that benefit, there are actually other benefits that having trees in space could provide for the International Space Station. So I did touch on this a little bit, but the International Space Station is constantly in need of resupplies from Earth. They're constantly needing new materials being brought up to the space station, and that can get really expensive, especially when we think about how in the future we're not going to want to just move to the space station. We're also going to want to go for longer missions in space travel. You know, we'll want to make it to Mars. We'll want to go outside of our solar system. And in those cases, the resupply is impossible. You know, it would be too hard to get from Earth to resupply these ships. So we need to come up with different ways of getting around that problem. And what this could be known as regenerative solutions, or solutions that kind of keep growing on their own. They don't need this resupply. And the great thing about trees is that they're regenerative. They're constantly growing, and so they'll be constantly taking in carbon dioxide. And so, like we were talking about a closed loop system or an open loop system, this system between trees and spacemen would be closed looped. The trees would emit oxygen that the astronauts could breathe, and then the astronauts would exhale carbon dioxide, and then the trees could take in that carbon dioxide and turn it into oxygen. So we'd have this closed loop system of supporting life on an International Space Station, or a long-term flight space shuttle, or maybe even on Mars. And so with that, we want to think about, well, how can we get trees onto the International Space Station, and how can we support them and keep them thriving? Because trees are used to the conditions of Earth, and so they don't necessarily grow super well in space because they're not used to that environment. So we would need to have trees that can handle the tough environments that are found in space. This could involve a bunch of different species of trees that each have their own benefits. Maybe certain trees can handle colder temperatures, or maybe they can handle more extreme temperatures, or maybe they grow faster or store more carbon. Each tree species would have its own different things that make them great for having on a space station, so we'd probably want a mixture of them. And scientists could also use genetic modification to make certain tree species do an even better job at some of these things that we want them to do. For example, we could genetically modify a tree to be able to withstand the freezing temperatures of space so it wouldn't harm them. They would actually do well in that kind of environment. We could also genetically modify them so that they don't use as many nutrients as a typical tree would, because again, nutrients is just materials we need to bring from Earth into the space station. So the less nutrients they need, the better. Another possibility would be to recycle the spaceman's waste as nutrients for the tree. We could use it in the soil, and so again, we could kind of close that loop, and we could create these regenerative ways to create to support the environment for these trees. A big problem, though, will be water, because both spacemen and trees need water. And guess what space doesn't have? It doesn't have any water. And so that will be a big challenge for scientists to come up with and how to handle in the space station, because it can be very challenging to get enough water to support the day-to-day processes of the spacemen as well as the trees. And so some additional problems may be, excuse me, how do we support these trees in addition to crew? Like I just said, they need a lot of water, and so do crew members. They'll need lots of water too, so finding that balance. The trees will need the soil, the nutrients. Remember, we looked at that carbons need to find a good way of getting soil up there. And then we also need to ensure that they get enough sunlight and the right amounts of it too, which is something we don't really have to think about when supporting a crew on the space station. So previous research, because remember the space station is just a giant experiment lab, they found that trees and other plants growing without gravity have issues with their root development, because again, the trees and plants are not used to the conditions of space, and so they're not used to growing up there. And so one possible alternative or solution would be having the keiki growing on Earth, and so that they can develop their roots properly, and then we can then transport those trees up into space after they've grown up. Again, we can use genetic modification to improve these tree species to make them more able to live in the conditions of space. We could do it so that they use less water, need less nutrients, or maybe even do things that are better for us, like store even more carbon or produce more oxygen. We could, tweak their genes so that they can do these things better. And then another possibility is that the trees could be a possible food source for the crewmen, because again, the spacemen need to eat, but all that food has to come from Earth at the moment. They need resupplies, and so having trees on the space station would be very useful. So then they don't need all of those supply shipments, because they'd have food growing right there for them. So while it may be impractical right now for us to have trees and other plants on the space station, of a better solution as time goes on and as we have more people and we get farther from Earth, the resupplying that we do now is going to be less and less of an option. And so if with these experiments that have happened on the space station currently, there's been good success with certain plants. Especially they've been experimenting with different food crops for the spacemen and the crewmen to eat. And so there's been successes of growing cabbage, potatoes, and lettuce on the space station for consumption. And then algae was also another thing that was used as a possibility for producing oxygen on the space station. Like plants, algae also are part of the carbon cycle, and they take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. So they could also play that role on the space station. And while the experiments right now are small, they're just a small number of plants, and they need to be scaled to produce enough of whatever it is that they're producing, whether it be food or oxygen, for the whole space station. Future work can be done to figure out better ways to make this happen on the space station. And so as we're thinking about trees on the space station, there's a few key attributes that each tree has that we want to think about when we're considering which trees to go up on the space station, what what makes a tree very good at storing carbon and releasing oxygen for these astronauts. And we're going to talk about each of those today and also tell you how you can kind of figure out these attributes for trees that you see around your neighborhood. So key tree attributes is what I like to call them, is the tree species, what kind of tree it is, the height of the tree, and then there's these three qualities right here called crown spread, crown density, and dieback, and I'll talk about those later and explain what those are. And then we also want to look at the overall health of the tree. So we're going to talk about how you can describe these trees outside, how you can look outside and figure out more information about the trees that you see. So I want you to take a couple of minutes to go out to your backyard or maybe look out a window and find a tree and tell us something fun about it. And so it can be anything you want. Maybe you have a really big tree in your neighborhood or in front of your house. Maybe you have one with maybe a tree house in it, or you've got a swing attached to it, or maybe a tree that produces really nice flowers or really yummy fruit. But I want you to think about that or go out and look at that tree and then come back and tell me something fun or interesting about it. So let's see. It is 10:22, so maybe come back by 10:25. Let us know what you found out about your tree. And tell us in the chat box. All right, so it's 10:25 and it looks like we got a lot of really nice answers here. A lot of people have avocado and lychee. That's awesome. Oh, there's a cherry blossom tree with pink blooming flowers. That's really exciting. Oh, and someone's doing some air layering, so that's really cool. That's a process to basically create a clone or a copy of your tree, and it can start growing roots, and then you can plant that keiki out, and then it'll grow into a whole new tree. That's pretty cool. Let's see. Oh, yep, and someone has a genetically modified lemon tree that can grow really fast. That sounds like it would be perfect for the space station, for sure. So I have a tree outside that's really big, and so it provides a lot of nice shade for when I want to read outside if it's too hot. Okay, so awesome answers. That's great. And so as you can see, depending on where you are and what trees are planted outside, they all have these different qualities that are really cool. And it's just how you can figure out what type of tree you're dealing with. And so if you look on the left right here, this is a category system for the different shapes of leaves that trees have. And when you have one species, it will always have that same shape of leaf. So that can help give you a clue as to what species it is. And if you look at the center with the bark will always have a particular pattern depending on what species you're looking at. And there are kind of different categories of these bark patterns that you can look at. And then this last picture right here is something that you would see in maybe like a book. Usually is a picture of the tree, which is that little black image that you can see with each entry. It will kind of show you the general growth pattern of that tree. Then they'll usually have a picture of the leaves. And then also, if it has flowers and seed pods, they'll show you pictures of that too, or maybe the fruit. And things like that. Those are just kind of the key features you can use to identify what species of tree it is. And if you notice all these different pictures, some of them can look really similar to each other, especially the leaves can look really similar. And so if it's not the right time of year where the tree or other plant doesn't have the flowers or the pods on it right now, because that is something that's seasonal, it can be really challenging to figure out what tree species you've got. And so this is really a skill that takes a long time to develop and practice, but it's a really important one, and it's really neat when you can go walk around your neighborhood and you know what different species of trees you're looking at. And so there's a lot of cool online resources and books that you can get that if you're really interested in this topic, but it's really hard, and it's definitely not something I could teach in one field trip. But if you are interested there's a lot of different sources online and books that you can look into if you really want to learn more about how to identify different species. And then the next thing that I'm going to talk about is tree height. And this is a really important attribute of the tree. And there's a lot of different ways that you can figure this out. There's some expensive equipment that you can do that uses lasers that helps you get the height of the tree. But there's a neat trick that you can do to estimate the height of the tree. Anyone can do it from your own home. And it's called the stick method. And that's what this diagram is showing here. But I always think that seeing it is easier. So I actually have this short video that we're going to watch that will teach you how to use the stick method for measuring or estimating tree height.
A walking stick is a great thing to have in the fields, but did you know that using just this you could estimate the height of a tree? Oh, and welcome to Country Ways 1 Minute ID. Let's have a go at measuring the height of that young oak behind me. You're going to measure along this stick the distance from your eye to your outstretched fingers, like this. Let the stick swing, and where it's pinched, that's the important thing. Hang on to that. That's going to help you estimate the height of a tree. Find your tree, hold your arm out with the stick vertical, and line up your hand with the base of the tree and the tip of the stick with the top of the tree. And now you have to measure where you're standing to the base of the tree. And the easiest way to do this is just to pace the distance. 20 paces. Of course, you need to know the length of your pace. Lay out a tape rule at 10 foot and pace along it, counting how many paces it takes you to cover that 10-foot distance. In my case, it's 4 paces, which means each pace of mine is approximately 2.5 feet. So that's 20 paces to our oak tree. 20 times my pace at 2.5 feet gives us a total of 50 feet. So our tree is approximately 50 feet high. You can refine this by adding the height from your eye to the ground. In my case, that's 5 feet. So perhaps a little better estimate would be 55 to the tree with a stick. A walking stick is a great...
So yeah, so you can have a stick and you can use that to measure the height of any tree anywhere. And it's a really neat and easy tool to get a quick estimate. And since a stick is pretty much free, it's a really cheap and cost-effective way to get the height of a tree as well. So you should definitely try that out sometime today, maybe out in your backyard with maybe that tree that you found that had an interesting fact that you shared with us today. And so the next attribute that we can look at with the tree is called the crown spread. And all this is a measurement that's trying to give us an idea of how many leaves that tree has, because these leaves are really what dictate how much carbon is getting taken in and how much oxygen is getting released. And so similar to that stick method, we can use our pace to do this measurement. So if you look at this image on our left here, we've got the tip-to-tip measurement of that crown. And what we would want to do is we wanted to walk along the tree from tip to tip of that crown, and then we'd use our pace as a measurement to get that measurement. And so we would do the longest spread of that tree, and then we do a perpendicular pace to that tree, so the longest cross spread from that pace. And so you basically would get a length and width of the crown spread. And again, on the left here, we can see what maybe a wider crown spread would look like versus a narrower, smaller crown spread within the same species of tree. And so doing so helps give us an estimate of how many leaves that tree has. And so then the next step would be to look at the crown density. Again, this is another measurement to tell us how many leaves that tree has. And basically what you want to do is just estimate how many leaves total is in that crown or that top of the tree with all of the leaves. And so what you can do is you can go closer to the base of the tree, maybe at the trunk, and then you want to look up. And when you're looking up, you want to see how much light is coming through. How much light can I see? Because that tells you how little or a lot of leaves are there based on how much light you can see. Because if there's a lot of leaves, then you're not going to see much light. But if there's not a lot of leaves, then you might see a lot of light. And so looking at the right figure here, we've got these boxes that kind of represent what that might look like as you're looking up. So if a tree is really sparse, you're going to see a lot of light coming in. There's going to be a lot of white light coming in, and there's only going to be a little bit of black dots, which would be the leaves blocking the light visibility. And then as you get to more and more dense, as you go down this figure, there's going to be a point where maybe you can't see any light at all. There's barely any light coming in, and that would mean that there's a lot of trees, so it's really dense. And so in doing so, you can kind of have these different categories or classes of tree density, whether it be very dense or dense, maybe moderate or medium density, or sparse or very sparse, meaning very few leaves. And again, we want to know how many leaves this tree has because that gives us an idea of how much oxygen is being produced and how much carbon is being taken in by the tree. Happy with its current environment or conditions. It might be lacking nutrients or something's messing with its roots. It's hard to say, but it gives us an indicator of how happy that tree is. And it's a little hard to identify, especially if you're living somewhere where the trees fall off in the fall. You know, they lose their leaves. It can be hard to look at. But basically what you want to look for is trees where in the crown, there are leaves in some spots, but in a place where it looks like there should be leaves, there aren't any. And that's a really good sign that this is dieback. And so the two pictures on the right, I think, do a good job of showing what that looks like, where there's sections of the tree, usually at the tips, that are missing leaves, and it looks like there should be leaves there. And that's called dieback, and that's just a sign that the tree is unhappy, it's not doing well. And what this is really useful for is our last tree attribute, and that's rating the overall health of the tree. And so basically, the healthier and happier a tree is, the better it's going to be doing its job of taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. So it's good to know how healthy the tree is that you're looking at, because then you'll know how good it is doing, giving us benefits. And so usually what people will do, like scientists who are looking at these trees, is that they'll give them a rating of anywhere from like good health to maybe medium or stressed to poor health to dead or almost. In 3, we can see it's starting to lose its leaves. It doesn't have. It has maybe some branches. It's just not looking as full and full of life. And then what of a job is this tree doing at the things that we want it to do? And that's why it's important to take all of these attributes into consideration when we're thinking about which trees are going up into the International Space Station or which trees we have in our neighborhood, because we want those good benefits that the trees can give. And so now now that we know all this information about trees and what we're looking for, let's go back into space and think about why these things would be important. So I want you to tell me if you know anything about Apollo 13. And it's okay if you don't know anything, we'll talk about it, but just let me know about Apollo 13. Oh, I see. Okay, a name of one of this crewman, Jim Lovell. That's great. As someone else says it was a successful failure, I would say that's very true. Okay, so that looks like everyone who had something to say. Oh, we just got one more. Yep, did not go to the moon. Correct, yes. So, and we will learn about why that was the case. Okay, so this is actually the real live audio clip from space, coming all the way from space.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main beam plus undervolt.
Roger, main B undervolt. Okay, stand by at 13.
All right, so some of you might recognize that clip, or maybe you recognize what he says. Houston, we've had a problem, because that is a pretty common quote that people like to say these days whenever anyone's had a problem. It's very famous, and it comes from the Apollo 13 mission. So the Apollo 13 mission was a space mission that was meant to land on the moon. But, however, shortly after they got into space, an oxygen tank failed. And remember, this oxygen tank was to provide them with oxygen to breathe, because on a space shuttle in space, there is no oxygen. And so what happened was when this oxygen tank failed, there was a problem with too much carbon dioxide inside this small confined space of their space shuttle. And carbon dioxide, when it reaches too high of a level, it can actually be harmful to humans. And so their lives were at risk because this oxygen tank had failed. So they had to figure out a way to get rid of all this extra carbon dioxide. And what the astronauts did to survive was they modified the air scrubbers inside their shuttle to remove more carbon dioxide. And if you remember, all the way from the beginning of this talk, we talked about air scrubbers from this mineral called zeolite, and how it's important for the carbon dioxide to get scrubbed from the air and then taken out of the space station, because we don't need it, and it can be problematic if there's too much of it. So they had basically the same problem, just in a space shuttle instead of the space station, where they had too much carbon dioxide. So they were able to survive by, again, modifying these air scrubbers to remove even more carbon dioxide than what was already getting removed. I don't think it was zeolite that they were using. It was probably a machine, but they were able to change it so that way it took out more of the carbon dioxide to make up for the failed oxygen tank. And what we can take from this is that similar things could happen larger scale on Earth, because as you might know, that there's too much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere right now, which is causing climate change. And so a lot of scientists have recently been thinking about ways to get rid of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, not just thinking about it on the space station. And so typically what they'll try to do is this thing called carbon capture and storage. And it's a complicated process, but I'll try to simplify it to make it easier to understand. Basically, carbon dioxide gets released at power plants that are burning fossil fuel. Liquid can get transported to other areas for storage. So rather than the carbon getting out into the atmosphere and causing problems, we can just liquefy it and put it somewhere else. And so this liquid carbon dioxide dioxide, as seen in this graph, can get moved through pipelines into storage areas. It could also get, so beyond pipelines, it could also get moved by vehicles, you know, like cars or ships. We could drive it somewhere, we could transport it maybe through a train. But a lot of times we're talking about pipelines here. These would be pipelines that are underground, kind of like how water gets to your house. So these pipelines full of liquid carbon dioxide would then get pumped into different geological features underneath our Earth and under the soil, just down really far below, deep underground. And that could be maybe coal beds or a saline aquifer, some salt caverns, or a depleted oil reserve. So that would kind of create this system of, you know, pulling oil out, and then it leaves this space where we can then put liquid carbon dioxide into it, and then we leave it there for storage. So because they take carbon from the atmosphere and then use it to grow, and so this carbon gets stored primarily in wood, so in their trunk, but it can also get stored in their roots and in their leaves and all over the plant, basically. So so these trees can take in all this carbon and then store it, just like what we would do in this figure here, but it would be a natural way of doing it. And one thing to keep in mind is that, as you can see in the diagram here, when the tree dies or when any dead wood falls down or leaf litter, if the leaves die, that stuff will decompose and then slowly release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So it's a temporary storage system for carbon. And so that's important, and I will go into that in a little bit. So one cool thing to think about is that there are more trees on Earth than all the stars in our galaxy. We have tons of trees on Earth, and there's space for more of them. And like I was saying, trees can be one way that we store carbon from the atmosphere and keep it from causing climate change related problems. But again, the key thing to remember is that when the tree dies, the carbon gets released again. So it's temporary storage, it's not permanent. And what this means is two key things. When we plant a tree, the tree has to be cared for and survive for it to successfully store that carbon. We can't just plant a tree and then leave it there. We want to take care of it and make sure it continues to grow. And so, and then the second key thing of that is we want the tree to stay growing for as long as possible for it to completely store that carbon. So we don't want to plant it and then maybe chop it down 5 years later for its wood, because eventually that would just cause the carbon to get re-released. We ideally want these trees to be growing long term. So if we're going to use trees as a method for storing carbon, we want it to be there. We want these trees to be growing for a long time and be well maintained. And so thank you all so much for listening to our lecture. We hope that you realize a little bit more about how awesome trees are and how in the future we're going to have trees in space and beyond. And I just want to open up the dialogue to any questions, and just mahalo nui for your time and attention. And so if you have any questions for me, you can go ahead and either unmute and just ask them to me directly, or you can type them into the chat. But thank you. Okay, I got a question. Could you please explain what Smart Trees organization's goals are? Yes, so Smart Trees Pacific is a nonprofit that I work for, and we are an urban forestry nonprofit. So our main goals are supporting and promoting urban trees in our urban environments. And so just recently, we helped hosted Arbor Day this year, where we gave out free trees to the local community. We also have a citizen science program called the Citizen Foresters, where we go out and collect data on those tree attributes that I talked about and taught you about today. And we map them on a big map, so we have a big system of all of the trees on Oahu and where they are and what they're doing. Okay, and then I see another question. You mentioned growing keiki trees and sending into space. Why don't they just grow from seeds? Yes, so my understanding is that if you try to grow the plants from seeds in space, the lack of gravity causes issues with their root development. Now, sometimes the space station can have artificial gravity, so I'm not sure if they could, but if it's not under those conditions, then the roots, I don't know if we know why yet, but the roots just don't do a great job of developing, and then they're not successful in space. Yeah, so can you talk about where the citizen science community groups are and how to join? So right now we're based primarily on Oahu. We have had our citizen foresters go through Kailua and Kaneohe and Manoa and Kaimuki. All of those places are finishing up, and right now, while we are on pause due to COVID-19, because we want to keep our volunteers safe, when we are allowed to start volunteering again, we will have volunteering going on in Honolulu and the surrounding area. And if you are interested, we have a newsletter as well as you can be a volunteer. You can sign up on our website, and I think Wei might be able to share a link to our website where you can sign up. You can also reach out to me if you would like to just sign up for the newsletter. Maybe you're not ready to volunteer, but you want to hear about our organization. You can just send me an email, and I will type my email into the chat if anyone wants to get signed up for that newsletter. And we also have a Facebook page if you want to like and follow us. We keep news and up-to-date stuff about our organization and what we're doing. And I'm going to type in my email right now. Okay. Did they send any trees up yet? So I don't think they have any up currently for the reasons that we brought up. So I don't think there are any growing right now specifically to produce oxygen on the space station or take in carbon dioxide. I think all of the plants growing on the station right now are all experimental. So it's scientists looking at how they grow, how they can do a better job of growing them, and experimenting small scale what different benefits they could provide on the space station. Okay. And then learned so much today. How is Oahu doing regarding tree population? Yeah, so we are, unfortunately, it depends, but we're not doing great. We have urban trees, and maybe Wei, you can post a link to Tree Plotter where we have our big database so you yourself can see the trees that we've mapped so far. The problem is we did do a study a few years ago, and it used a special system called LiDAR, and it's basically a plane that sends down signals and can tell what areas have trees and what don't. And we did it, I'm forgetting the years, I want to say it was 2011 and 2014. And we compared to see how much coverage had trees and how much didn't, and how that changed. And unfortunately, we saw a significant drop in tree, like our urban forests are decreasing. And that's why we have events like Arbor Day, where we give out free trees to encourage our community to plant more trees and increase that urban tree coverage. What jobs are there for people who like trees? Yeah, so there are all kinds of jobs out there. You can work for the federal and state government as a forester. Or even the city level, so you can have a government job where you work on caring for these trees. You could have a job with a nonprofit like I do that cares about the urban tree environment, and we work a lot with city, state, and federal government officials whose job is to help promote our urban environments and help our urban trees. There is also, if you're looking in the private industry, there are things called arborists, and these are basically tree specialists, and they go out and they help individuals or even companies take care of their trees, and a lot of times what they do is they help with tree removals, tree plantings, and trimming trees because, for example, if you've got a tree growing under a power line, they'll need to be regularly trimmed so that way the tree branches don't get in the way of the power line. So yeah, arborists kind of take as like a private sector, and they're like tree experts that can help take care of trees in all kinds of different environments, and they also can help consult. So they basically just help tell people what trees would go best where. And so if maybe an arborist would work with like a landscaper, and maybe, oh, I don't know, like a hotel is redoing their landscaping and they want to maximize, how many trees they plant. The arborist could help tell them, oh, you should plant these trees here and you want to keep them this far apart, and can help with things like that. Are you involved in the efforts to remove the invasive albizia? Not at the moment, because most of those invasive albizia are not in our urban environment, and we specialize in our urban forests. Those albizia tend to be on state land, or out in the native environment, unfortunately, and so that's not our area of expertise. What do you do about dieback? Yeah, so this is actually a thing that an arborist could help with, because arborists are pests or disease. So an arborist would be able to help with figuring out why a tree is getting dieback. Like I said, dieback is something from a tree that shows stress or it's unhappy, and that can be a lot of different reasons. It can be anywhere from like a disease or a pest. It could be a nutrient deficiency, meaning that they're not getting enough of a particular nutrient. I know that there's been some really strange cases, like a tree has gotten dieback because they were regularly parking their car underneath the tree for the shade, but the tree's roots were so large and underground that actually the car was sitting on top of these roots and disrupting the tree and disturbing it. And so the tree was actually getting unhappy because of the car that was parked underneath it. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, but we got 4 more minutes, so if you come up with anything, feel free to type it in the chat. Otherwise, thank you for coming, and yeah, if you have any other questions that you think of after today, you can go ahead and either send me an email, or you can take a look at our website. We've got a lot of information just on the basics of urban trees as well. Okay, we hear about invasive and natives. What are some of the issues? Yeah, so basically somewhere else. And what can be problematic is that because they come from somewhere else, they don't have any controls, any natural with the animals here. But basically what this does is it allows this tree or other species to spread rapidly. And so that can cause a lot of problems for our native trees. And unfortunately, in our urban environment, a lot of the trees that we do plant are not necessarily invasive, but they're not native. Because in order to have trees on our roadways, there are really specific requirements that they have. Particularly with making sure it doesn't block people's view, it doesn't cause problems with the sidewalk, doesn't cause problems with the wiring, etc. So that can be hard to follow, and especially considering that an urban environment is very different than their native habitat. And then like another person had asked about albizia, which is invasive in our native forests, particularly because it grows and spreads rapidly and can crowd out other species, but it's also very dangerous. It has a tendency to fall down a lot, which can be dangerous for anyone who's nearby as well. in space there are no natural pollinators. The flowering and fruiting can be that you can have. So some trees are self-pollinating. So you only need one of that tree in order for it to get pollinated. But there are trees who aren't self-pollinating and need help with that. And I know a lot of times researchers or scientists can fill that role rather than having pollinators do it. They can manually pollinate, but that is very time consuming. So small scale in the space station as of right now, it probably works just fine. But as we move on to get bigger scales of trees out in space, it probably would not work. So that would probably be something that the scientists need to think about, is how can we pollinate these trees. Maybe we need to bring insects or other pollinators up into space with us. Another solution could be that genetic modification that I was talking about, how as we genetically modify these species to handle the harsh conditions of space, we could also genetically modify them so that they are self-pollinating and thus eliminate the need for pollinators, manual or otherwise. Okay, so we are out of time, but thank you so much for coming along with us on our virtual field trip. And I believe this session was being recorded, so you'll be able to check it out on our YouTube channel as well. At some point, maybe a week from now or so, we'll have this recording if you'd like to rewatch it, or maybe check out those videos again, etc. And yeah, if you want links to either of those videos that I showed or links to other resources, feel free to send me an email and I can get those out to you. But mahalo nui.